In Medellin's newspapers, new reports of murders kept surfacing. In the last few days, on the eve of Halloween, several crimes had been committed and the culprit had not been found. The most curious thing was that all the victims had something in common. Corpses of thieves, mobsters, murderers, con artists had been discovered. People were terrified, not knowing who was responsible for all the slaughter. However, many felt relieved seeing how several criminals were falling at the hands of a secret vigilante. One night, a man arrived at the police station, blood pouring from his torso. He was clutching the wound but couldn't stop the blood from seeping through his fingers, splattering all over the room. The woman at the reception jumped up at the sight of him and offered to call an ambulance immediately. However, he asked her not to call the hospital. He had something very important to declare, and it was urgent. The woman quickly escorted the man to the on-duty officer's office. When the officer saw him, he reacted just as his colleague had. He urged the man to accompany him to the hospital to tend to the wound, but the injured man again refused the help. Pressing harder on the cat on his side, he confessed to the officer that he knew who was responsible for the murders happening in the city. The officer watched him impatiently, unable to take his eyes off the wound that looked worse by the second. But the man remained firm in his decision to stay. "I have only a few minutes left to live. If we leave, I'll die on the way to the hospital. So I'd rather use the little time I have left to tell you what I've experienced and who's behind all the famous Halloween crimes." The officer got ready to type the statement on his computer. First, he asked for some personal information, then asked him to tell him everything he knew. The man, with nothing to lose given his dire situation, clarified that he was involved in transporting illegal substances. The officer and the receptionist exchanged astonished glances at such a confession, but they didn't interrupt and listened attentively. He told them he was in one of the darkest streets of the city, about to close a big deal with 2 other narcos. He omitted the names of the other criminals to avoid harming their business. The officer insisted that he needed the names to escalate the case, but the criminal shook his head. "The names of my partners are not relevant to this investigation. What matters now is that you know who is responsible for the recent murders, not to conduct a raid to catch illegal substances dealers. If you don't want this information, I'll just leave, and you'll remain in the dark about the culprit." The officer apologized and pleaded with him to continue with the statement, as they would lose access to very important information. The wounded man continued his story, recounting that while he was closing a deal with one of his partners, they both heard screams nearby. His companion disappeared, thinking someone had betrayed them and that it might be the police. But he recognized those screams as a cry for help. He cautiously advanced and, hiding behind a wall, saw a woman. Since several themed parties had taken place before Halloween night, it wasn't unusual to see young people in costumes, pretending to be zombies, monsters, or the dead. But the young woman he was watching didn't have an ordinary costume. She hadn't even bothered to mask her face. She was a brunette with a red ribbon in her hair matching her dress. The color did a great job of hiding the blood stains on her clothes. She also wore long socks and black boots, and in her hand was a long, shiny knife that almost looked like a sword. The blood staining her clothes didn't seem like something bought from a joke shop, nor did her sword seem like a toy. He realized that her victim was his other partner, the one they were supposed to meet who hadn't shown up at the agreed time. He tried to stay silent, but couldn't help letting out a small cry at the sight of the pool of blood beneath his business partner. The young woman noticed his presence, and without making any expression, neither fear, disgust, nor vengeance, she simply turned and fixed her gaze on the criminal who had discovered her. The man's blood ran cold under the girl's piercing stare, and suddenly, without giving him time to escape, she let go of the wounded body, and in the blink of an eye, launched at him with her sharp sword. He let out a weak scream, but the street was deserted and the young woman had completely immobilized him. "So you are a bad man too." He tried to free himself while asking her who she was. She smiled maliciously and replied that she was a vigilante with a mission to rid the world of all human waste. The man's eyes widened as he realized he was face to face with a person responsible for all the recent deaths in the city. He accused her of being a murderer, but she placed a finger on his mouth to silence him, while proudly and happily saying, "I'm not a murderer. I've cleaned the city of filthy criminals." She described herself as a messenger from heaven, sent to make all sinners who were turning the world into a dark and terrible place pay for their deeds. And during these times when everyone was hiding behind costumes, it was the perfect moment to carry out her cleansing plan. The criminal, knowing he had no escape, called her crazy and a murderer, claiming that by committing all those crimes, she was just like the rest. She burst out laughing, which only made the man more furious, and he began hurling every insult he could think of. Crazy, psychopath, murderer! Suddenly, something interrupted him. A deep slash across his torso made him cry out in pain, his body drenched in red. The young woman pulled the knife back out of his torso and wiped the blood on her dress. Then she got off him, stood up, and ran away. As she did, she shouted back at him that it didn't matter where he went. That wound would kill him in a few minutes. And if it didn't, she would come back to finish the job. When the criminal finished recounting the story, the police officer and the receptionist were stunned. They apologized and stepped out of the room together to speak privately. The man's confession seemed real. His words sounded sincere, and given the connections between the deaths, they could be dealing with a person who, without any fear, had taken justice into her own hands to make the area's criminals pay for their crimes. A couple of minutes later, they re-entered the office. There was a large pool of blood on the floor, and the lifeless head of the man was resting on the police officer's desk. They approached the table and saw that a word had been painted with blood: justice. In the window stood the young woman that wounded man had described, wearing her red dress and holding the bloodied sharp knife. She stared at them intently but didn't attack. Without saying a word, she leaped out of the window and disappeared into the darkness. Who was that young vigilant? Her name was Hannah, a teenager from a religious family who had moved homes a year ago. Before, they lived in a very peaceful town with neighbors who were almost like family, helping each other and treating one another with great respect. When the young girl arrived in the city, she felt very strange. She had never known violence until she got there. She couldn't understand how there were people who hid their parents and children, how so much vice existed with illegal substances, and how some people killed others for money. She believed that the city was full of criminals, creating a frightening environment and world for teenagers like her. As the months went by, Hannah gradually adjusted to her new life. One day, while they were having dinner, a piece of fish fell from her plate, staining the carpet she was sitting on. Without realizing it, a curse word slipped out of her mouth. Just as she finished saying the word, her head snapped 90 degrees from the slap her mother landed on her face. The woman glared at her with eyes full of fury, as if she was about to devour her daughter. Hannah looked at her father for support, but he simply gave her a tired look and let out a sigh. Hannah apologized for her behavior, and her mother turned her back on her. Unfortunately, this situation was not new to her. Days passed, and the teenager's father seemed to have adapted more easily to the city's way of life. However, her mother couldn't contain her anger at the sins surrounding them. The arguments between her parents eventually led to their separation. The man could no longer endure his wife's constant yelling and threats. So one day, he decided to leave home in search of a better quality of life. When Hannah came back from school and didn't see her father, she asked her mother where he was. The woman replied coldly, without looking at her, that they had separated and he had abandoned them. The young girl felt her heart shrink, not because of her mother's coldness, but because she realized that her father, the only person who understood her, had left and had abandoned her with that woman who had become the very devil. She wiped away her tears and tried to convince herself that it wasn't true, that it was just another one of her mother's tricks to make her suffer. But she was wrong. The next day, the man returned home to collect his things, fully determined to go through with the separation. Hannah threw herself into his open arms and hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Then her mother's shrill voice broke the beautiful moment between father and daughter as she said, "Don't worry, dear. You'll stay with me, your beloved mother. Your father prefers a life of vice and sin, but we will follow the path that the Lord has set for us." At that moment, the young girl couldn't take it anymore and angrily shouted that she didn't love her. Then she ran to her room, tears in her eyes. She never found out what happened, whether her father truly wanted to leave her or if her mother had interfered to keep him from taking her away. The only thing she knew was that she felt incredibly lonely and sad since that day. She never heard from her father again, and life with her mother became more and more complicated. They no longer spoke. They only fought over everything. But one night, everything changed. One of her classmates had thrown a costume party for her birthday, a nighttime celebration that of course her mother had forbidden her from attending. To her mother, that kind of event was strictly off limits. But Hannah, tired of constantly obeying orders, pretended to be studying and snuck out through the window. When the party was over, she climbed back into the house the same way and buried herself under the sheets without changing out of her red dress and hair ribbon. She had barely been in bed for 2 minutes when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She thought it was her mother coming to punish her for disobeying, but soon realized the footsteps didn't stop at her room. They continued down the hall. A short time later, she heard her mother's screams. She jumped out of bed and grabbed a knife she kept on her nightstand. It was a keepsake from her father, who was a collector of such items, but tonight it would serve as protection. She quietly left her room and crept toward her mother's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. As she approached, she witnessed the most horrifying scene of her life. 2 men were mercilessly beating her mother. Her mother's screams and sobs created a lump in Hannah's throat. Despite how strict her mother had been with her, she was still her mother. Without thinking, she rushed out of her hiding spot with the knife and screamed at the men, trying to get their attention. They were startled to see her, as they thought the woman was alone in the house. Hannah shouted in disgust, "You will die, human scum!" She lunged at them, stabbing them repeatedly. Her mother stood aghast, watching as the men's blood splattered across her daughter's face. Though Hannah had never done anything like this before, she seemed to have a natural talent for fighting off those criminals. The knife no longer felt like a weapon in her hand, but an extension of her arm, which surprised her as well. When the 2 men lay on the floor, bleeding from their chests, her mother stood up and faced her with a stern expression. Hannah thought she was about to hug and praise her for helping, but her mother's reaction was different. She slapped Hannah hard across the face and yelled at her angrily. The blow left her stunned, and her mother was screaming at her, completely out of control, terrified of the consequences of such a brutal killing. But Hannah couldn't hear her words. In her mind, that woman was only telling her that heaven had a mission for her, to eliminate all the human scum and create justice. Now it was her responsibility to rid the world of those who needed to disappear. So, guided by the words echoing in her mind, she plunged the knife into her mother. The woman let out a scream of surprise mixed with pain and collapsed dead on top of the other 2 bodies. After killing her mother, Hannah adjusted her dress and stepped out into the street to continue the mission that God had entrusted to her. She had eliminated those human scum, but her work was not done. She had to create a world free of sinners, and she would not stop until she achieved it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode.